Dr. Tony Edmonds, February 18th, 1981. Would you like to get started by just giving me a brief background of how you came to Ball State?
Yeah, I finished my coursework in prelims for my PhD at Vanderbilt University in 1969, and in April of 1969 I was job hunting, needing money to support my family. And I got in contact with several universities that I knew were looking for positions, people in my position. And about April or May, the only two job possibilities that looked solid was one at the University of Alabama and the other at Ball State. I didn't really want to go to Alabama because I knew that Alabama was still governed by George Wallace and that there had been some academic freedom problems there. Ball State offered me more money. There were two people I had known at Vanderbilt already teaching up here, and so when they offered me the job, knowing very little about the school, I said, well, it's a job. I'll be teaching. And so I came here in 1969 is really the only viable job opportunity I had at that time.
Okay. When did you first become associated with this movement then?
My first real association was while I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. The first year or two I was there, I guess I would describe myself as a kind of Kennedy liberal, and I was basically in favor of the war and the way it was being conducted. I figured it was necessary to use flexible means to stop communist advance. I didn't see it as a civil war. I saw it as a communist incursion. I was never in favor of launching large-scale nuclear war or attacking North Vietnam, but it just seemed to me to be a good kind of war because it was limited, and yet it was still forceful. But around 1966, 1967, I guess from doing a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, and associating with some people in the anti-war movement, I gradually began to see, at least in my opinion, that not only was it immoral and unjust, that it was really counter to what I perceived to be America's national security. And so I guess my initial organizational involvement, or near organizational involvement, I was a graduate assistant at Vanderbilt, teaching a section of freshman Western Civ, and one of my students that year was the president of the SDS at Vanderbilt, Students for a Democratic Society, and he asked me if I would be willing to be the faculty advisor to SDS. I thought that was kind of funny at first, that the revolution needed a faculty advisor, but I decided to think about it, and so I went to a couple of SDS meetings. I found them not very productive at all. Too much, the SDS did not believe in hierarchical bureaucratic structure at all. Everybody was equal to everybody else, and the meeting was just an unorganized shambles, and I decided that that organization, as far as I could tell, wasn't going to get much done. And so in 1968, as I became increasingly anti-war, but not radical in the sense of being part of, any violent movement or any movement against the university or so on, it struck me that Eugene McCarthy's presidential campaign offered the best chance for some kind of anti-war action. And in Nashville, I became involved in the McCarthy campaign, handing out literature, knocking on doors, that sort of thing. And then when Bobby Kennedy came in, since I've always been sucked in by the Kennedys, I joined Kennedy's campaign until June of 1968 when he was killed. And then for the rest of 68 and 69, until I came to Ball State, I was involved in writing my dissertation. My wife and I had our first child, and I really, although I remained opposed to the war, I really didn't see myself as having the time to be involved. But when I came to Ball State, I really had high hopes. The baby was a year old, didn't need quite as much attention. The dissertation was almost done, and although I devoted a lot of time to teaching here, I really thought that with Nixon obviously not doing anything to bring the war to an end, that a school like Ball State, I thought, a large Midwestern university, would be a good place to get students and faculty members involved in doing something to indicate opposition to the war. In fact, I remember one sad and amusing incident about the third or fourth day I was up here. It was early September. School had just started, and I lived in a house not far from the Johnson dorm complex. I remember taking the garbage out one night about 9:30 or so, and I heard this roar go up from Johnson Hall. And obviously it was a large student demonstration of some kind. And I was really pleased. I'd only been here a little while. I didn't know anything about the school. I said, damn, there's real potential here for developing an anti-war movement. They're out there demonstrating already. And I climbed a fence and walked over to see what the ruckus was all about. And what it was a panty raid. To be brutally frank about it. And at that moment, I had a kind of vision of, oh my God, what have I got myself into? This is a 1950s high school, not a 1960s university. And so I became a little bit disillusioned then, until in October of '69, a month later, Mary Munchell, a Ball State student, was part of the organization of the Vietnam Moratorium movement. The notion of using large-scale peaceful demonstrations to act to prevent the war. And so, although I never, I guess, was an official member of the organizing group, I was kind of an unofficial advisor, discusser, hanger-on. And it was either October or November of 1969 I participated in my first demonstration, which was I guess it was November because it was very cold, I remember. There was a march of Ball State faculty members and students from campus to downtown, and I can't remember the exact location. It was at a park somewhere. There was a rally and there were speeches and so on. And there must have been, 200, 300 people, faculty members and students, who in the evening marched down the street singing "Give Peace a Chance," carrying signs. And the two things that again stuck out in my mind, two or three things really, was a real sense of being a part of something, an emotional feeling of joining with like-minded people for a good cause. But then that was always counterbalanced by what I perceived to be real resistance on the part of most Ball State students and on the part of the townspeople. Three things stick out in my mind. As we were walking down Riverside by Fraternity Row, the reaction of the people in the fraternity houses, which was, absolutely vicious. Names being screamed out, beer cans being thrown, go back to Hanoi, that kind of comment, a total lack of understanding that all we were doing was exercising, our rights to petition, grievance, protest under the Bill of Rights, and the real sense of hostility on the part of a lot of the kids in the fraternity houses. Second thing I vividly remember is I was on the outside of the march carrying a sign, and the police were leading the march, or at least not that the police were involved in it, but there was a squad car that I guess was there to protect us as much as anything and lead us through traffic. And a car had sort of pulled up beside us, and this gentleman leaned out the window and looked directly at me. And I must admit I stereotyped him because he had a crew cut. He looked like H.R. Haldeman's brother or something. His neck had obviously been out in the sun, and I swear he was wearing white socks, so it was my image of the great Middle American hillbilly. And I remember him looking at me and his face getting even redder than his neck was, staring at me with absolute hatred in his eyes, not knowing me from Adam, and calling me every name in the book. I had heard all the words before, but he put them into combinations that were totally new to me. And, and I won't repeat his exact language, but it included all the classic Anglo-Saxon words. And then the last word he used was communist. You blah, 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 blah. Communist, why don't you go back to Russia? And I was somewhat taken aback. And feeling a little impish, I suppose, and I looked at him with my sweetest smile and said, "Why, sir, I'm certainly not a member of the Communist Party. Communism is far too conservative and bureaucratic for my taste." The look on his face was worth the jibe. So again, this concept of real hostility on the part, on the one hand, symbolically, his fraternity row giving us all kind of hell, and then this townsperson comes up, and I guess we had some hopes of marching in order, I don't know, to convert some people. People would see, dedicated faculty members and students and be converted. And as we marched along, it became more and more apparent to me that we were true believers, but it was very difficult to convince most of the students here, and certainly most of the community, of the justice of our cause. The only convert we made that night is we were walking down, Washington Street or Main Street or one of the downtown boulevards, and this lonely figure stumbled out of a bar, obviously drunk, gave us a quick peace sign, and said, "Yeah, wow," and then stumbled back into the bar. We heard nice speeches, all of which we had heard before, and all of which we agreed with. Some nice music, and then we went back, straggled back to our houses and dorms. Again, a combination feeling. Personally, it was a very fulfilling thing for me, but in terms of affecting any kind of action, I don't think it did, really. Muncie and Ball State are just not the kinds of places that would respond very positively to something they saw as unjust or unnecessary criticism of the government.
Okay. So there were three things that stood out in mind, the back of the fraternities.
Yeah, the fraternity guy, the guys, the guy who stopped in his car, and the gentleman who stumbled out of the bar and gave us a peace sign. Again, as an ex-English major, I tend to view the world symbolically anyway, and I saw these as kind of symbolic messages, but looking back on it from my perspective now, it's easy to see, in a sense, the kind of hopelessness of what we were trying to do. But at the time, although I knew maybe it was hopeless, I want to stress this. There was a real sense of camaraderie and community, I guess. Even outside of the ultimate object, which of course was to affect some kind of change in policy, it felt very, very good personally to be actively involved in really speaking my conscience, trying to say this is wrong. I want to do something to try to stop the war, even though in a I suppose a more rational sense, I knew that what we were doing probably wasn't going to have much effect at all. And of course, Mr. Nixon made it very clear that he was, watching a pro football game while we were marching. In other words, our demonstration was not going to have any effect on American policy and so on.
What was the administration's mood at Ball State during all this, and the faculty members were marching and students?
Well, I can give you one example that I'm personally familiar with. The other time incident that I became very actively involved, in fact, the most actively involved I became, was after the invasion of Cambodia in spring of 1970, and then the killings at Kent State. The Kent State killings took place on Monday. And I can remember all of us who had been involved in one way or another in the anti-war movement were especially irate at that conjunction of events. The invasion of Cambodia seemed to us obviously to be a widening of a war that Nixon was supposedly trying to stop. And then the killing of the students at Kent State really hit home. Kent State is a school very much like Ball State, and although there were more problems at Kent State than there were at Ball State in terms of demonstrations, still it struck a lot of us from what we knew at that point. I still think that the National Guard totally overreacted, that the road shouldn't have sent them there in the first place, and that to us this was just a key event. I mean, our government was killing us, I guess literally, is what we decided. So a number of students and quite a few faculty members decided that we wanted Ball State to joined with some 300 other universities throughout the country and had a very clear and definite kind of protest. And there was a student senate meeting, I guess that Wednesday, and some of us had thought that one way we could approach this was have a one-day student strike at Ball State, in which students and faculty members just simply would not go to class. And then there would be a big meeting out on the commons on the main campus, and speeches, songs, demonstrations, and so on. We didn't want to do it in violation of any kind of policy, because that's what the students at Kent State had done, and the National Guard came in and blew them away, and I guess we didn't want that to happen. So we went to the Student Senate, and the Student Senate, in a very, very crowded, emotional meeting, overwhelmingly passed a resolution in favor of a student strike. Again, which kind of amazed me, because Ball State is a very conservative, even then was a very politically conservative campus. The vote was something like, I don't know, 48-4. I think you can find that information in the old Daily News somewhere. And my recollection is the strike was then set for Thursday, the 8th, if I'm not mistaken. It might have been a week later. I'm a little foggy on exact dates. To my knowledge, the administration did not object at all. There was no attempt to stop the strike. I think, and again my memory is foggy here, I think a ruling came down from the president's office that professors should conduct class that day, but it was implied that if they didn't, there would be no retribution on the part of the administration. The students should go to class, but if in all conscience they did not or could not, then there would be no retribution. So I think the official stance probably was one of, well, the strike shouldn't take place, but the unofficial signals we got pretty clearly were that the administration wouldn't mind. Well, the students in charge of the thing, because they knew my reputation and my participation and the fact that I love to get out in front of people and yell and scream, asked me to give the major opening address on Cambodia, American and Cambodian affairs. I went to the library to do some research and discovered a real dearth, a paucity of material on Cambodia. I found out a few things, wrote the speech, and then expected maybe, 500-600 people. The day before the strike, we were handing out red armbands for people to wear, and my recollection is we had about 6,000 of them and gave every one of them away. I'm not good at crowd estimate, but I would say at 10 o'clock that morning when I got up to give my speech, and I stood out on the Vatican porch there, on the Arts building, there were somewhere between, I'd say, 2,000 and 3,000 people out in the Commons area. And the speech I gave was not, I wasn't lecturing, it wasn't a class, and I felt I could certainly display the way I felt. It was in some ways very emotional, but also I thought reasoned, total attack upon the Nixon administration, Nixon's handling of foreign policy, the Kent State affair, extremely critical of the National Guard and the governor. It was I guess for me at the time, it was a very radical speech. It wasn't inflammatory. I didn't say people ought to go out and burn the buildings down, because I didn't believe that. But I remember it being very filled with rhetoric and so on. I have only second-hand information of what happened, but my department chairman told me the next day that he got several calls from the ad building that didn't exactly threaten anything against me, but did strongly suggest that you ought to muzzle that rabble rouser. We don't want him up making speeches anymore. I guess one of the things that upset the administration is that in this time period, Ball State did not have a public television station, an NET station. There was a local TV station that was on Channel 49. And on the local news that night, since nothing ever happens in Muncie to make the news anyway, and here was a big event, on the local news that night, I vividly remember almost the whole news program, all 30 minutes, was devoted to the Ball State strike. And about 10 minutes of that was a direct shot of me giving that speech. Ball State professor Anthony Edmonds, etc. And naturally, and I suppose I see why they did this, they focused in on the most inflammatory comments I made. Someone asked a question, what did I think Richard Nixon was trying to do by going into Cambodia? And I said in my full rhetorical glory that I did not dare try to wander around the mind of Richard Nixon for fear either of getting lost or dying of pollution, something like that, which got a great laugh from the crowd, but here it appears on Muncie TV. Someone else asked, how do you propose we withdraw the troops from Vietnam? And I said, same way we got them there, by land, by sea, and by air. And so you can see, it's a big speech, it's a protest, it's lots of rhetorical flourishes, but I can't prove this, but I got the impression that after watching that on TV, some of the administrators and maybe some of the local high-ranking conservatives, businessmen here in Muncie, thought this was, giving Ball State a bad image around the state. There's an old cliche that in the 60s, people would like to send their kids to Ball State because it was a safe campus, unlike IU and Purdue and other campuses where there was a really large, powerful radical movement. And I had the impression that some people were a little afraid that all of this publicity Ball State was getting in the anti-war movement would scare people off. And so my department chairman told me in his office the next day that he had gotten phone calls from the administration, and he said, I told them to go to hell, that I don't agree with what you say, Tony. The chairman was pro-war, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So he took, the classic old free speech stance, and I really appreciated that. So I got the impression that really the administration was trying to play it very carefully. They didn't want to be hard-nosed and say, absolutely no, you cannot have this rally. But at the same time, they didn't want to appear to be condoning the kind of attitudes expressed at the rally. So again, on a public level, they said you should go to class. On a private level, it was made clear that there'd be no recriminations. And as I say, personally, I just heard from my department chairman that some people in the ad building, for various reasons, thought that I was in error giving that speech.
Okay. Do you think that this strike intensified ill feelings in the Muncie community in Ball State?
I have no direct evidence that it did. As I say, after my initial march into the Muncie community and finding so little response there, most of my activities were on campus, and I didn't know that many people. Again, this was my first year at Ball State. The main people I knew were faculty members, so I don't have any direct evidence that it really angered people in the Muncie community that much. I could hypothesize that a lot of people would be upset and sort of mumble about those radicals out at Ball State. And if ever I heard mumbling like that, I would just giggle because Ball State was not a radical campus. I don't mean to be cynical, but I suspect most of those 5,000 or 6,000 students who, quote, went on strike decided it was a nice spring day and here's a perfect excuse not to go to class. Again, that certainly not all the people who participated did so for that reason. But no, I didn't get any direct sense in which that bothered the community. I think probably what had a bigger impact on the Muncie community that would be favorable to Ball State is not long after the strike, Ron Ziegler, Nixon's press secretary, appeared on the Johnny Carson show. And he was obviously talking about the war and the anti-war movement and so on, and Johnny Carson asked him a question about, well, all these campuses are rising up, opposing Nixon's policy, lots of people are against it and so on, and Ziegler said, well, you have to be careful. Remember, there are a lot of students, a lot of campuses that really support Nixon. And he pulled out a telegram that had 3,000 signatures on it supporting Nixon's war policy. And he said, this telegram comes from the fine students of Ball State University. So in terms of actual national publicity that would reflect on Ball State, that was much more newsworthy in terms of national publicity than our little strike was. I mean, hell, when we had our strike, there were, as I say, 300 other universities having strikes too. About 200 of them just flat closed down for the rest of the year. which of course Ball State didn't do. We had a one-day strike, so that didn't achieve national publicity. It achieved some local publicity, and I can imagine that there were some Munsonians who were upset. But I think most people who know Ball State realize that those of us who were anti-war were really a very small minority.
Did you participate in any of the teachings held after the strike?
Yeah. Now, again, I sort of get them confused because in that spring I must have given 15 or 20 different speeches to different classes and different groups, but I did see, at least my perception of the kind of role I could play, since I'm basically a teacher, would be through teaching. I remember even before before Kent, let's see, I guess it was in March of 1970, before Nixon even went into Cambodia, the Cambodian government had just been overthrown and a new government was in, and somebody asked me to give a talk to a group of students on the new government in Cambodia. And I gave a brief, basically fairly rational, scholarly talk. And then at the end of it said, someone asked me, well, with this new government, which was pro-American, do you think this new government will ask American troops to come in? And I said, in one of the great faux pas of my life, I said, it is my prediction that there is absolutely no way in which Richard Nixon will send troops into Cambodia. 20 days later, he sent troops into Cambodia. So all throughout that spring, even before the Cambodian thing, I was involved in teach-ins. And generally in the teach-ins, I tried to be a little more balanced than I was in the big speech at the rally. Because I knew there was a guy speaking right after me. In fact, he's a judge in Muncie now, Richard Daly, D-A-I-L-E, or Bob Daly, I can't remember. But at any rate, he gave a very rational, pro-administration talk at the big rally, and nobody listened to it. Everybody listened to the anti-war statements, but not the pro-war. But during the teach-ins, I tried my best to give both sides of the argument.
Was there a very large turnout for these?
No, maybe 30 or 40 people would come to each one.
Who would you say came?
People who already believed. This, again, I think was one of the great paradoxes, at least in Muncie, or at Ball State of the anti-war movement, and that is that essentially it was a cadre or a hardcore of 30 or 40 people, mainly students, some faculty members, and they were the ones who generally did the speaking, who came to the speeches, and again, except for the big rally where there were 3,000 or 4,000 people, it became, again, kind of frustrating to devote all of that time and all of that energy, and seemed to be making so little headway here. Incidentally, the same 25 or 30 people who were big in the anti-war movement were also the same 25 who were sponsors of Earth Day and in the ecology movement, the same 25 or 30 who were in the women's movement, and the same 25 or 30 who supported the right of the Black Panther organization to have a representative at Ball State, that sort of thing. So there was I don't like the word radical, let's say an activist core at Ball State that became involved in lots of movements, but it was it was really never more than sort of a floating figure between 25 and 100 maybe.
Were there very many people who came from the community to join the students in their efforts?
Very few. One I remember, and this is someone you might want to talk to too about the reminiscencing. The black minister J.C. Williams, who was active in the civil rights movement here in Muncie, came to the big rally, I remember, and gave just a wonderful speech in which he said, in a sense, now you white folks know what us black folks have been going through for 300 years. You saw 4 of your own killed at Kent State. It's been happening to blacks for generations. And a very inspirational speech. The mayor
Talking about Judge Daly and the Muncie mayor.
Yeah, that as far as community participation, my recollection is that Daly was the only person from the community who came, and he came to present a kind of legalistic pro-administration position. The mayor of Muncie, I guess it was Paul Cooley at the time, who didn't show up. None of the town's business leaders that I know of showed up, none of the community leaders, except for J.C. Williams, the minister, so I didn't get the sense that there was a great deal of community support for this.
You mentioned that 3,000 students had sent a telegram, and there's another incident where one of the residence halls, Beeman Hall, sent a letter to Nixon in support of his efforts. Were there very many efforts on this part?
Given my political stance at the time, I would not know firsthand about efforts to support the war. It was my impression, though, that efforts to support the war were mainly not so much marching and demonstrating and so on, but petitions and letter writing campaigns as the one at Beeman Hall. And the organization had a name, Students for, oh heck, I can't even think of it, but there wasn't a pro-war organization here at Ball State. For obvious reasons, I didn't have much to do with it, except to oppose it. But there was some effort. I guess what surprised me is I thought the anti-war people were devoting a lot more time and energy in seeming to get, say for the one big rally, very small response. And I got the impression the pro-war people, all they basically needed to do was walk around the dorms and people would sign their petitions, which indicates to me, again, the basic student attitude at Ball State was one of either, you know, I don't really care, I got a high lottery number so it doesn't matter to me, or basic support for Nixon's policy.
Do you remember the events that surrounded the May Day event in 1970?
You mean the March on Washington? For some reason I thought that was 71. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just reading a book about that. May Day was 71, right? I remember the only Ball State connection I would have with it. I remember the Chicago 8 activist Rennie Davis came to Ball State in March or April and gave a convocation speech. One thing I remember about it is it was the first speech I'd ever heard at Ball State in Edmonds Auditorium in which the word fuck was used, much to the dismay of the administrators. I think the exact line is, his last line was, we oppose the war because it's just fucking wrong. And the crowd really cheered at that. It was a pretty good crowd. In fact, the place was full. And I know Davis talked a lot about getting Ball State students to organize buses and go to Washington, lie down in the street, try to shut the government down. A bus did go from Ball State. I was not on it. I can't give you the name of someone who was, though, who was a former faculty member here. His name was David Cammons, who was also in the history department and involved in the anti-war movement. And he came back just absolutely really high about the events, or at least high in the sense that a mass of people were there trying to do something. Also, one student I knew was one of the ones who was arrested. And of course the charges were thrown out, and you may be aware that several years later the courts ruled that the government had to pay anybody they arrested something like $10,000. And I can remember this poor guy could not prove that he was there and was arrested. They had lost his arrest record. He was really irate. I've got to back up on one thing. I mentioned David Cammons. Cammons did not go to the May Day thing in 71. He went to the big November demonstration in Washington. It was either November or April, in which around 700,000 or 800,000 people went. And the May Day thing in 71, there were only about 10,000 or so. 10 to 20,000. But there was a group from Ball State both at the major march and then also at the May Day thing. But I was not directly connected with that. I think by then I had become, I was working on a book for one thing, and I had really become kind of disillusioned. Not that I had changed my mind about the necessity of the war ending, but it was really like beating your head against a brick wall. And I said to myself, hell, if I go to Washington, that's 3 days and $200 and I'll be away from my family. And you know, it just, on some level, it just wasn't worth it.
Do you remember any of the events that happened on campus while May Day was occurring?
No, not specifically. Was that the time they had the threatened dog burning? I don't even remember there being tear gas in Cooper.
Would you like to expound on the dog burning incident? Because people in the past have mentioned it, but they don't remember very much.
I was not directly involved in it. And again, you say that was May of '71. I had even forgotten exactly when it was. I did know a couple of the students who were involved. A guy named Rick Kramer and another guy whose name I have forgotten. Almost came to me. His nickname was Grub, that's all I know. What they were trying to do, well, let me back up. The publicity that went out that said that on a certain day a dog will be, gasoline will be poured on a dog and he will be burned. It will be in front of the administration building across from the student center. And it was said this is designed to illustrate, symbolize the lack of concern Americans have for life, symbolize the napalming of children in Vietnam, and so on. I talked to Grubb either just before or just after the thing happened, and he indicated that the real purpose behind it was to rile up people at Ball State and in Muncie, to get them out, not for violence, but to get pro-war people out to throw their bodies down to protect that dog. They had no intention of burning the dog, absolutely none. It was kind of like, an Abby Hoffman guerrilla theater sort of thing, a media event. And the main point he wanted to prove was that all of these Munsonians and Ball State students would come rushing up to save the dog. And then he would make the point, see what is more important to you, the life of a dog or the life of thousands of Vietnamese. Obviously, you'll go over hell and high water in order to save a dog, but you won't do anything to save all the Vietnamese being killed. I know it did get a lot of publicity. I know a friend and former student of mine named Dave Grindstaff, a veteran of the Vietnam War, organized a group of people, and if they had tried to burn the dog, he told me they would violently prevent it, or try to prevent it through violence. But of course nothing ever happened. About 600-700 people gathered around. There were speeches, songs. A little puppy dog was there. And there was a lot of shoving and no bad physical violence, but kind of shoving and yelling and so on. And then it was called off when it looked like people really might get irate enough to commit violence. But once again, it was a symbolic thing. There was absolutely no intention of roasting the pooch. It was just a way of bringing attention to the fact that somehow Americans care more about dogs' lives than human lives.
You said you wanted to break. Do you want to do that now?
Yeah, why don't we? Is there any way you could come back some other time? Because